Hello, family. Welcome to JFK Today, your direct link to all things politics, comedy, and culture. I am your host, Janaya Future Khan, champ yapper and frequent nuisance in the activist and comedy worlds. Let's get dialed in. Here are our top stories. We're going back to our traditional format. We're hitting new nominations, a Nazi march in Ohio, and what we can expect with Sarah McBride, the first openly transgender woman in Congress at a time when the rampantly anti-trans and bigoted GOP owns the presidency, the House, the Senate, and also the Supreme Court, right? Right before we jump into that, some quick hits. There's a class action lawsuit against ginger ales. Did you guys know this? The ginger and the ginger ales are not real. I did not know this. So this, of course, when I say ginger ale, I am only ever talking about Canada Dry. What the fuck is Schweppes? I don't even know. That does not register for me, but apparently that's included, okay? Canada Dry always. But none of it is real. So there's a class action lawsuit for false advertising, negligent misrepresentation, and all sorts of fraud claims. So I got this from the lawyer, Angela. She's always talking about, court cases and lawsuits and everything else. But apparently, right, it should say, legally speaking, right, there's all these FDA federal regulations around that of artificially flavored. If the actual substance is not ginger, it's artificially flavored. The other side of it is that it's like they've used the word natural, and there's natural, Canada Dry out there, and I have had that. And apparently that's also not real. So there are damages for anyone nationwide, potentially, right? For anyone who's bought these ginger ales. And you know what? I'm just going to say it right now. This might be how the races come together, my friends. This might be it. This is it. Because whose immigrant parents did not tell you to drink ginger ale as the cure-all? Which black person? There is nary a nignog out there that has not had ginger ale. You were told to drink ginger ale, you drink ginger ale now. Anytime that you have a tummy ache, anytime that you don't feel right, anytime you're getting a fever, it's ginger ale. That is the solve. It is perfect. It's a perfect beverage for when you are ill. And honestly, I'm going to tell you right now, right? Because I've not met one black person that has not had ginger ale. And this might be the only way that black folks get reparations. Like, get in on this lawsuit. Where do we sign up? Where's the settlement at? I have been laughing at this. I'm like, this might end the race war in America. Speaking of nonsense, did y'all see that Dr. Oz is now going to be nominated in Trump's as part of Trump's team? I can't. Oprah's Dr. Oz. Remember that guy? Yeah. So Trump has picked Mehmet Oz to serve as the administrator for the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here, right? A guy with no experience and no qualifications whatsoever, who I'm pretty sure his license expired like years ago, right? He's got no expertise in this. He's going to be in charge of overseeing programs that impact more than 150 million Americans. 150 million Americans. Do you remember that Dr. Phil, another one of Oprah's dudes, right, was all up in Madison Square Garden, and he was yapping about Donald Trump and everything else too, and he became this rabid Trump supporter. And I'm like, Oprah, you unleashed two of the most crackpot so-called doctor experts on American civil society. In girl, I'm gonna need you to do that. Oprah, right? You had them on your little own network, and I'm gonna need you to own this one. Okay, it's not enough for you to just produce a little Kamala Harris event now and again and get paid for it. I'm going to need you to like own this one and figure out how to take these little snake oil salesmen out, because this is getting ridiculous. And speaking of nominations, this is a good time to mention that Trump is also nominating Linda McMahon as the Secretary of the Education Department. Now, if you are a nerd or a lover of wrestling, right? And if you are the uninitiated, welcome in. Yes, this is Vince McMahon's wife, the guy who was all up in the Netflix docuseries recently. Well, I grew up watching the WWF. That's what it was called back then before it became the WWE. And I'm very familiar with the whole McMahon family, right? From Vince to Linda to Shane and Stephanie. And right now, even Triple H, who's married to Stephanie, running the whole thing. I know about it. That was my soap opera. This is stressful. I just want to be really clear. Let me break this down, right? She's a billionaire pro wrestling mogul. And Trump is entrusting her to oversee the dismantling of our federal education in America. That's what's going on. Vince McMahon's wife, Linda McMahon, who is running like a small business council, is now going to gut our education. And I gotta tell y'all, like, this is wild, but I started to laugh because I'm like, this truly, it's like, do you remember that question a while ago? Somebody asked, are we living in the Truman Show? Here in America right now. And I realized something. We're not living in the Truman Show. This is like if like Republican, Midwestern white moms had a fantasy football pick for their government. This would be it. This is it. This is it, because our government is literally about to be run by Fox News hosts, like reality and talk show TV stars and billionaires. Like, that's where we're at. What did we do to deserve this? There's like, if we weren't caught up in it, I would watch this show. This sounds like a shit show, and I would absolutely watch it. Like, this is going to be a wild time. This is absolutely going to be a wild time. Speaking of wild times, right? And we've been in them for quite some time now. Remember precedented times? Bring those back. I miss precedented times, okay? I mentioned in the top lines that there is a far-right neo-Nazi march in Ohio this weekend. So you know how that goes. We can expect that in America. We've seen that before. We've definitely seen that before. But what really drew my attention to this, of course, isn't the fact that, it matters that these things happen. We should never downplay them. But how we talk about them and how our news talks about them does matter, especially in this moment where we're studying the game tape and looking at all the pieces, right? Let me play this CNN clip for you. So this is Dana Bash, CNN's Dana Bash, and she is talking to a Democrat, right? A Democrat congressman about what's going on. Landsman, right? Representative Landsman. Let me just play it for you, and then we'll talk about it. Let me just play this shit for you right quick, okay? So they are talking about the march that happened, and you will hear the Nazis yelling in the background.
Talk about something that happened over the weekend, not in your district, in Columbus. A group of neo-Nazis paraded through that city waving swastikas, covering their faces. This is not the first time this sort of thing has happened in Ohio in particular, and of course it's continuing to spread. We don't know what side of the aisle this comes from. I mean, typically neo-Nazis are for the far right.
Yeah. Just hold on. We don't know which side of the aisle they're from. She just said that they were holding swastikas and flags with swastikas on them and that they're neo-Nazis. But you don't know which side of the aisle they're from? Okay.
You had protests from the far left at your house.
Correct.
As a Jewish member.
Yeah, they slept outside my house for days. And
yes, I am seething at this.
My takeaway is this has got to stop. And the surge of anti-Semitism is global, but it's certainly here in the United States, and it does require leaders on both sides of the aisle to say, don't do that.
Is your party doing that enough?
I think some in my party are doing a ton, and some are silent.
This is nuts. Like, this is unfucking believable. What is Dana Bash doing on CNN? You belong on Fox News, you freak. Let's just get into the first false equivalence that came up, okay? That neo-Nazis are the same as anti-genocide protesters. Let's be really, really fucking clear about that. This is unbelievable and so irresponsible. Like, this beyond my outrage. It's actually so unbelievably irresponsible to conflate the two. And not only were these protesters who were running an anti-genocide campaign to try to petition and appeal to the government to change its position on Israel and push it for an arms embargo, right? At the very least, a ceasefire. Right? These are anti-war words that matters. Not like Nazis and the far right and neo-Nazis literally have an unbelievable history of violence, So that's number one. Like, that is so messed up. And number two, do you see what they did right there? This is what we've been talking about taking the narrative of Jewish people away from whiteness, because that conflation right there, that, that there was something anti-Semitic about these protesters doing what they were doing. And that, like, as if, and let me just, there's a piece that just drives me nuts. Jewish folks, Jewish people in an unbelievable amount of protests were organizers of it. Like, Jewish people and the Jewish voice was leading so many of these anti-genocide, pro-Palestinian marches. And it's just, this is what we're seeing, like this seizing of the narrative, the erasure of Jewish identity in favor of this, like, this full-on white one that is anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-protest. And I'm sorry, that is just not the Jewish tradition. This is so ridiculous. I will say this, right? I personally have always hated going to the houses of politicians. I have hated that as a tactic. And, I think now and again, I totally, get it. But it was always not a good move to me, because you always have to look at, does the end serve the means? And it doesn't. Like, it never does. The optics of it are used against us so in such a hard way, and the value add is so minimal, it's not worth it. So just from a strategy perspective, I've always hated that. That has nothing to do with this person's position, but let's be really clear. This is a Democrat, right? So when we talk about, like, the Dems not being, they are illiterate, right? Like, Dana Bash, a Democrat, potentially. I mean, she doesn't sound like one at all. This is to be clear, Dana Bash, conflated, what's it called? Campus protesters with Nazisms earlier this year. I'm not even joking, right? Like, I'm not even joking. Those were students, and she did that. So she often yaps using a very Zionist, or I should say, like, Netanyahu talking points. I can't believe this nonsense, right? I can't believe this. And, like, yeah, they were outside of my house for days, and, the rampant anti-Semitism. I'm like, okay, cool. So let me get this right. Campus protesters, right? Anybody who is anti-genocide and neo-Nazis all are after Jewish people and are also the same. Wild, illiterate, illiberal. That's what we're dealing with right here. So let's be clear. all we need to do is start yapping to dismantle these kinds of narratives. This is so ridiculous. I would listen. I'm about to detransition just so I could get in a fight with Dana Bash. I swear to God. This is going an 8-week testosterone hiatus. Start walking around in heels, because that's so irresponsible and so unbelievable. But this right here, this is CNN, right? This is viewed by not as many as they used to, certainly, but like, millions of people overall, collectively. And these are the folks who are shaping the narratives on identity. It's just like, cannot wait for us to build this shit at scale. Literally can't wait. Anyway, it's a good moment, right? When we talk about illiberalism with Sarah McBride. Listen, she hasn't been sworn in yet. She literally she's a representative elect, right? I think we all know that Republicans were going to go after her hard. I didn't expect, and I don't think McBride expected, right, based on what I've read, for them to come this hard, this fast. And yes, it's a white woman. Yes, it was. So here we go, right? This is where we're at. We have the first openly transgender person elected to Congress, and it's a transgender woman. And I want to really emphasize this because trans women are like ground zero. And so often, even when we talk about healthcare and access to healthcare and trans rights, et cetera, it doesn't actually include them in the way that when we talk about equality, it doesn't actually include women. Because women, right? Okay, so this is where we're at. So we knew that GOP lawmakers who have pressed to roll back transgender rights across every context in the country, they've now moved. They moved to bar Sarah McBride, right, from women's rooms in Capitol Hill. These fucking fucks. So this week, right, McBride is doing what every new congressperson is doing, is, going through mandatory cybersecurity training, setting up her payroll, selecting district offices, and learning how to introduce a bill when her new Republican colleague, Representative Nancy Mace of South Carolina, yes, go ahead and remember that name, right? Nancy Mace announced plans to introduce a measure to bar transgender women from using women's restrooms and changing rooms in the Capitol complex. You raggedy bitch. This makes me so angry. This is just straight up harassment. It's bullying. It's disgusting. And it also shows, similar to right now, I want us to intervene with this narrative to sow division across the left when it comes to race and racial identity. What we're seeing with trans identity is the impacts of having lost the narrative, right? And, I want to be really clear. We were in and are in an impossible position when you live in a context the way that, oppressed people do, trans people do, poor people do, et cetera. And it puts you in a position where you can also put yourself in impossible positions. But I want to be really clear about the position we're in. One thing Black people do exceptionally well is we make language. We generate language and discourse when it's not there, right? We made up intersectionality because there wasn't a word to capture what we were going through. On a cultural level, think about the words like fleek, for example. Like we generate language, and I think we're at a point where we need to generate language because we have the formula. We have the formula somewhere, but we only told people the solution: trans women are women. Here's the facts, though. The narrative that we've lost it's specific to two areas, right? Bathrooms and sports. That's where we've really lost it. And both of those things are explicitly targeting trans women, bathroom and sports. And the thing that makes me angry is that they're non-issues. And that's the point. They're non-issues. But what happened is Trump and his entire campaign spent millions and millions and millions of dollars to create a narrative about trans people and trans women in particular in sports and how they're abusing girls and women. And, then you have a freak like J.K. Rowling who's so obsessed with trans women. I'm like, bitch, go on a date. Go touch grass. You have lost it. You have literally lost your mind. You have nothing better to do. Like, there's something not there's something not well with that one. And I think with people in general who are obsessed with trans people don't even talk about trans people as much as transphobes do. It's wild, right? And so we have this moment where we have larger, more urgent issues that we need to address, right? Like healthcare, for example, that go across the board. But but because of the attacks on two narratives that are non-issues, which again comes down to bathrooms and sports, those are the bills that have been introduced that are largely anti-trans. And yeah, a lot of them are healthcare too, but the driving cultural force, and the problem is that we're in right now is that this is a thing that I can't explain to you why, right? But the right, and I don't just mean Donald Trump, his administration, everything else, men, it's in the manosphere. It's a big deal to them. They have all weighed in on this. They've all talked about it. And it's because the narrative campaign. And not only did the Dems not run their own ads that spoke at all to trans issues or trans rights, but so there was an absolute echo chamber that was dominated completely by the right, but also we didn't either, right? And that a big part of that is because we don't have narrative power. Again, something that I hope this show addresses. We didn't have it. And I want to be really clear about creating more space for that as I talk, because I do, part of my job, I think, is to point out our gaps, our holes, our missteps, et cetera. But I also want to make sure that I'm providing a balance point. It's just, I only have so much time. And, it's time we get back to that 30-minute format out of respect for your time. Isn't that funny? With normal people, they'd be like, how can you have a show going almost every day? And we are going every day in the new year. Because I'm gonna need it more than y'all. Okay. I don't want to be alone in this. But, the issue for me isn't actually doing the research and organizing the thoughts and, writing the scripts and punching it up or whatever. And my scripts are really just loose points and, articles and clippings and my thoughts and musings. But, it's like I have too much to say. It's actually hard for me to fit it in this time. But so here's an example, right? I'm about to pull up another clip for you, and you're going to hear Jen Psaki, who I really like, from MSNBC. They need to do my girl right, though. They got you can't have a ginger with that much hairspray in her hair. When I see a white bitch on TV, let me see the hair move. The hair's got to move. It's got a free flow. I'm not seeing it. They're overspraying my girl, Jen Psaki, okay? But I like her. She's from MSNBC. They're much more well-versed on talking about issues than CNN talking heads. And so what she's going to do is sort of address directly one of the narratives on trans girls in sports. And this is one of the ways that you can tackle it. So again, it captures the essence of what I mean when I say it's a non-argument and a non-factor. But you will also hear a Democrat that has completely adopted these right-wing talking points because that's all that's out there. So that's really the takeaway that I want us to get out of it.
There's obviously a lot of soul searching right now going on within the Democratic Party, and that's a good thing. But what I worry about is that in the course of all that soul searching, some Democrats might reach the wrong sweeping conclusions. Republicans spent hundreds of millions of dollars on anti-trans ads this election cycle, including one that showed Vice President Harris talking about government funding for gender-reaffirming care for prisoners and detainees.
Okay, so remember we actually had that in the episodes and we laughed because it was like the niche of the niche. And I was like, how does Trump and his people even know about that? I didn't even know about that. That's like 2 people or 3 people out of 300 and, something million people in America. What a bunch of weirdos. Let's continue.
If that sounds like a particularly obscure issue, it is, because it applies to a tiny group of people. And it's also a policy that, by the way, was in place during the first Trump presidency. Another one of the lines that ran over and over again in those ads and throughout right-wing media is this idea that America is faced with a crisis of boys playing in girls' sports. Now, these ads created this perception that the issues of trans kids playing sports was dominating schools across the country, which is completely false. Some people got pulled into that argument. I mean, immediately after the election, Congressman Seth Moulton told the New York Times that, quote, Democrats spend way too much time trying not to offend anyone rather than being brutally honest about the challenges many Americans face. I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that. And
that's a Democrat. Again, a Democrat shaping the narrative that's supposed to be our voice. That's not our voice. That's not our perspective. This is wild. Like, this is wild. Like, we need to be able to speak to the issues that many Americans are facing. Many Americans are facing trans girls in sports. What are you talking about? Many Americans, I'm directly quoting here, so it's on purpose, but many Americans don't even know trans people. They've never met us. We're like a we're like a fucking unicorn.
And then last weekend, Congressman Moulton came on this network to discuss those comments.
I was just speaking authentically as a dad about one of many issues where I think we're just out of touch with the majority of voters. And I stand by my position. Maybe I didn't get all the words exactly right.
Idiot.
But the point is that the backlash I've received proves my point that we can't even have these discussions as a party.
So he's a loser. Don't worry about that. Like, it's completely bad faith. But this is a moment, right? This is a moment where our side, Democrats, and not just Democrats, our political pundits, right? A lot of the left-leaning, and some of what I'm using is air quotes, but like left-leaning, podcast bros in the manosphere, everybody has talked about this. It's not a small issue. It has been blown so out of proportion. Jen Psaki goes on to use examples where, like, in states where there was legislation, say in like South Dakota, for example, or Utah, like there was either 1 athlete or 0 athletes that were trans women or trans girls. It's a non-issue. But because we've lost the narrative, I think we have a choice to make where it's like, do we actually address this head on and say, like, there's like nobody in this. There's nothing here to deal with, right? In the same way that with bathrooms, it's a non-issue. We know that men who have intent on harming women and girls in restrooms, they have zero need to get dressed up to do it. Absolutely zero need, because they do it all the time as themselves. And in this country, nothing fucking happens, right? So it's a red herring. It's how the GOP used a wedge issue to literally wedge, but it's not small anymore. And I think we have a choice to make about how we want to address it, or if it needs to be addressed at all. This is something that I'm going to be sitting with, and I am sitting with, because my ear is so close to the ground when it comes to culture, and because I understand how widespread this is. Because for some people, it will work to just say, this is like a non-issue. There's like 2 or 3 people. That's the logical part of this, but there's something else that's going on. Of course, we know that it's transphobia, but it's being driven. When I say that millions and millions of dollars were poured into this, and that every single person on the manosphere, even idiots like Aiden Ross, Logan Paul, right? These are millions and millions of people who listen to their shows and their streams, mostly men. They've all spoken on this on some level. And unless there's a counter narrative, that is the story that continues. Now, we have a job to do where it's about making our story and ourselves and our narratives bigger. But for this one, I'm definitely thinking about it, because the larger issue to me is, how do we expand trans rights to trans women? And to me, of course, that means folding trans rights into women's rights. But then how the fuck do we make women's rights cool, right? Because it's not. It's not. And, it hasn't been for a really long time. And I think that's the part we have to figure out. So this sounds like a good moment. I don't often get a chance to hear questions beforehand, because they kind of just get sent to me out of the blue. Thanks, KR. Like, literally, there's like, we're just out here figuring this stuff out as we go. But let me hit this question, because I think it ties into so much of what we talked about this episode.
Hey, JFK. My question is in reference to the quote unquote culture war episode from last Thursday. Thank you for bringing up Jewish assimilation into whiteness with humor and nuance and tenderness. It's something I've been thinking a lot about since October 7th. And for example, when neo-Nazis in Ohio, as they did a few days ago, make a demonstration outside of a production of a play about Anne Frank, we could easily call that white supremacy or think of that as white supremacy, but ultimately it's white people hating on other white people, and really reminds me more of caste, the concept that Isabel Wilkerson really defined so well in her book and the movie from last year. And alongside that, I really appreciate the language and conception of oppression versus hate. That's all very useful. But regarding oppression, you've referenced your previous BLM work with a kind of eye roll vibe. You mentioned privilege not being useful. And of course, CRT was a flashpoint in the election. So at this point, I can't tell. I'm not sure. I'm a little confused about what role there is now for anti-racism. There's still a lot of shyness, as you referenced, and cringiness about whiteness and white people, how they show up or attempt to show up in spaces. White people still have a lot to learn about racial history and racist systems. But if anti-racist rhetoric adds fuel to the right-wing power and fire, what is the framing for conversations around race and the unpacking and dismantling of whiteness now?
What a fucking awesome question. And just in a slew of awesome questions that I get, this one is just right on point. And look, there's a couple of things. So number one, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, it's a very loaded conversation for me. During the eye roll has more to do with 2020 and beyond that, but an incredible, just an unbelievable, beautiful body of work was done. Between, I want to say like 2013, 2014, up to about 2018. And that work continues, right? If you look at, Maurice, who's running, Working Families Party, he was part of the brain trust of M4BL and of Black Lives Matter. There's been all these initiatives that have come out. We've, Black Mama's bailout that happens, every year that gets women out of jail when they're just sitting there. There's been no convictions. They're just literally too poor to afford bail. And sometimes that bail is like $30-$40. It's unbelievable. And just the fact that even I, went on to Color of Change, we're supposed to be like dandelions and cross-pollinate. So, but also I went through some personal shit, and, we all know what being in, really intense conditions with people can do and bring up. And don't worry. There's a redemption arc there that goes beyond what I spoke about, and will be in my book coming out next year. It's a memoir, If the Sky Should Fall, with Viking. Anyway, just I think that's a great question because I'm grappling with this too. And to be clear, I've hated the term anti-racism from its conception. I liked Stamp from the beginning. Right, like in terms of like a really easy to get sort of, American history sort of 101. But I've always found that term to be useless, and it's because you can't I don't have beef with Ibram Kendi. I just don't care for it. It's like what happens when you're in academia, but you're not actually an organizer, and then you start moving like you're an organizer. It's just 101. You do not frame your movement in the negative. That's not a movement. There's no action attached to it. And I felt the same way about Robin DiAngelo's useless work. And I don't want to say it's useless in terms of, that it's not useful for people to get to understand themselves and society on some level. But what we don't need is, I think, white people grappling with other white people on the matter of racial justice. The core issue is that segregation. We live in segregated societies completely, right? And then you have the fact that we are literally segregated from ourselves, right? Like men are just completely split from their emotional capacities and awareness. Women are just completely split and just smashed into these like unbelievably tiny spaces, and so on and so forth. And I'm in this reckoning moment where I'm like, we've had all of these movements, we've seen the limits of mass mobilization when it's not tied to a brain trust. And what I love about Black Lives Matter is that it did have a brain trust. That's why I can't just yap and say whatever I want online without getting those phone calls from scary, smart people who are just like, hey, Future, what the fuck are you doing? But part of how I got that nickname was just that, future forward kind of look. And I'll say this, I'm sitting in this because I think that the ways that racial justice has been framed and used, and the idea of understanding being the most important thing, is not necessarily useful when it's not driven by action. Because if the things that we learn, right, you feel a sense of shame sometimes, or you feel a sense of like, okay, well, now what, right? And that's it, the now what. So it's not that I'm necessarily frustrated, or I find that the body of work that we've all done collectively in this generation not useful. But I think we have to decide, what do we do with what we know, right? I've read Wilkerson's cast. I didn't find that framing particularly useful in an American context, but this thing as it pertains to like Jewishness and whiteness, I think that's really interesting. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. But I think that we're in this place where we have to decide what 21st century models of organizing look like, and that in America, right, there's this like chauvinistic kind of narrative of like, it's about self, betterment of self, understanding self. And I think that infected our racial justice rhetoric, where it was about understanding self. And I'm like, no, it's about understanding each other. That's it. It's about understanding each other and fighting for those things as if they were our own personal things, which is why, we have to move through identity, move away, and figure out what that system of values and beliefs are, so that we can apply the things that we've learned. It's not like nobody need, like, I don't want to, like, I'm being a bit cheeky, when I say, okay, cool. So I learned the words, we live in an imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, Christian heteropatriarchy. But what do I do with that information? If I'm not able to apply it to anything beyond an understanding, I feel nihilistic. I feel powerless, and there's nothing I can do. So we've got to be plugged into something, and it has to be more, like, where's, out of the thousands of people that Robin DiAngelo trained, how many of them actually have deeper or more meaningful connections, if any at all, to trans people or to Black people or to Native people? I had to go and form those relationships. You have to go to where the people are, and so I'm thinking about this, and we live in this online world, and I know that one of the key things I want to do is build out this platform with you all. And I don't just mean the show. I have me, I'm obsessive. I have a multi-pronged approach, and, I could really use y'all's help with that. And I need to be more vocal about what that looks like, so that, because I actually have some solutions, and my friends are really on me right now because I have a hard time advocating for myself. This is the first time, because it's not really for me, it's for this brain trust that I want us to build together as a collective. And I have a really hard time doing it because I'm so used to fighting for other people's dreams that it's really hard for me to do that here. But I promise you, like, I'm with you. I think when I say we're doing something, I mean we're really doing something here. And I want us to have our own platform, our own Substack, where people like you are writing under one umbrella of, like, this work that we're doing, this collective. And I want us to grow at scale. Like, I might be the person who's helping to organize this and usher this in, but I want this to be something that's owned by all of us, so that we can model the things that we want to see. Anyway, I just really love that question. Thank you so much for that. God, this shit really keeps me going. I've had a hell of a year, but it really does. And I do need to do a better job, I think, of advocating for this work and of explaining all the pieces, and I will make sure to do that. as we move forward. And I know I got to get back online. Anyway, sounds like it's about time to cue that music. But what a great question. What a great episode. Sending so much love out to y'all. Just want to say thank you so much for listening to JFK Today. It means the world to me. The show really is a labor of love. New episodes drop 4 times a week. We're available everywhere podcasts are. Don't forget to drop your voice note questions. JFKTodayShow@gmail.com. Shout out to KR and Carolyn and the JFK team. And shout out to you, the listeners, that make it all possible. Peace.